So, dear colleagues, I'm very pleased to present here the results of my scientific findings on my doctoral thesis that was published recently. And yeah, you can find the book here on the table. The marginalization of German victims politically persecuted is somehow comprehensible due to the pressure internationally the research gap that I have filled anyway is somehow surprising when we consider that Nazi persecution or the restitution for Nazi persecution has been already viewed from manifold perspectives. So in order to disentangle the complex restitution for German labor organization, I had to look, I applied the historical and also the post-colonial discourse analysis. This approach allowed me to shed light on the socio-cultural reality of the restitution proceedings and question how the negotiations were shaped with post-war values. On basis of historical sources, the micro-historical example of Hannover serves me as a starting point for this innovative approach, tracing the network between judiciary, politics of memory, as well as coping strategies with the past. My work starts from the assumption that in restitution proceedings, historical realities are produced and transformed. Starting from the Hannover example, in the restitution proceedings of the German Social Democratic Party, the German Communist Party, and the consumer cooperative societies, I have analyzed how these historical realities have been negotiated. The assets of an estimated value of 600 million Reichsmark have been seized and privatized during the Nazi regime. The confrontations with the persecution, as well as the historical guilt, uncover as symbolic acts how the own involvement was valued. On the psychological level, moral concepts were here clashing with economic interests and politics of memory in the German post-war society. In this sense, the restitution proceedings serve me as historical cultural sources on how the destruction of traditions and mobilization of labor organizations during the National Socialism was handled after the Second World War. Therefore, I followed the historical discourse analysis of Michel Foucault and questioned how under the surface of discursive strategies, meanings were formed concerning the Nazi past of labor organizations. I used the methodical principle of reversal and looked in the proceedings for so-called systems of shortage, Verknappungssysteme. In opposition to our traditional approach, it is not about seeing the sources in their inventive continuity. Rather, it is about making visible under the surface of the discursive strategies which meanings of the past were here formed. Which forms of reflexivity were present, and in what sense did arise from them what was accepted and perceived as memory culture by the post-war society. So I come to my case study of the Consumer Cooperative Society of Hannover. First, I would like to talk about their function as socio-economic self-help organizations and a social reformist instrument. German co-ops were established at the end of the 19th century, like the Cooperative of Hannover, which was founded by 100 workers in 1885. The workers paid minor amounts as shares, and therefore they were participating on the wins of the organization in relation to their sales. Hence, the consumer co-ops represented a serious alternative to the retail trade. The practical proximity to the trade unions and the German Social Democratic Party helped their economic upturn, especially after the First World War. When the economical crisis at the beginning of the 1930s started, there was a movement of 4 million members. The organization in Hannover had 35,000 members and assets in an estimated value of 17 million Reichsmark. The organization never reached these numbers again after the Second World War. The economic crisis was used in the early 1930s to stoke the fears of the workers and defame the socio-economic concept. The organizations were called gravediggers of the retail trade. In 1933, the so-called handing over of the German co-ops to the Nazi labor front took place. The boards had already before declared their loyalty with the Führer. Due to their double role as economic companies and solidarian workers' unions, the consumer co-ops were highly contested. On one hand, the members were persecuted as so-called Marxist elements, and the organizations defamed as uneconomic. On the other hand, due to their relevance for the supply of the population, their immediate removal was impossible. The Nazi labor organization, the economy ministry, and the trade group fought until 1941 over the power over the estimated assets of 500 million Reichsmark. The chosen strategy of economic self-preservation made it possible that the co-ops were fully seized by the Nazi labor organization first in 1941. But at the same time, their strategy consisted also in the Nazification of the member structure and even in the perversion of their former solidarian community. The first step towards the dissolution of the whole complex was made in 1935, with a Nazi law dictating the liquidation of 1/3 of German organizations, forcing them into privatization. During this forced liquidation, in many places, like in Hannover, exceptional acts of resistance consisted of the founding of so-called transfer companies as branches of the huge co-op wholesale companies. The sales of the co-op shops were self-managed by the co-ops themselves. This allowed to sell the shops preferably to their former employees, following the interests of the organization. How far the Nazi ideology was before and after 1941, for example, concerning the racial laws and the sale of food supply for Jewish population, in practice was not passed on. However, in 1941, the application of forced labor started, like in the large bakery in Hannover, with up to 30 forced laborers. Forced labor, as well as the supply of all forms of camps, like for Hannover, the supply with bread of the concentration camp Bergen-Belsen, were silenced in the post-war time. For the National Socialists, the transfer of the co-op assets under central control represented a challenge. The persecution, Nazification, and expropriation had to take place in strategic moments. Our fit resulted a complex structural and economical situation as a starting point in the restitution proceedings of the co-op Hannover. During the re-establishment of the co-ops, the British military government played a central role. because the thinking patterns of the post-war society were still impacted by the anti-cooperative agitation during the Nazi regime. In the British zone, in order to implement the restitution, a commission was founded. The Cooperative Societies Commission, located in Hamburg, approved in 1948 the reformation of the co-op Hannover and acknowledged its restitution rights. The organization received until 1955 approximately 1 million Deutschmark, as well as their large bakery. But in the case of the co-op shops that were privatized by the transfer companies during the forced liquidations, the post-war organization had to resign as it lost approximately 20% of the shops. In the statements concerning the restitution of the co-op shops, the impact of the Nazification of the member milieus is well visible. The discourse concerning the restitution of the Hannover co-op shows well how the blending of the labor ideology with the National Socialism had a long-lasting effect on the identities. On the moral level, we can talk here about restitution that claimed no more than a legal level. In the post-war time, the consumer cooperatives missed the chance for a new beginning by overemphasizing their victimhood and by silencing the loss of their intangible values. This form of coming to terms with the past resulted also in the loss of tangible assets and was carried by the silence of the German post-war society. It was at first the displacement discourse that made the restitutions possible at all. That's why I talk here about blindness to the past. From today's perspective, it seems paradox that former leading National Socialists were also part of the restitution commissions. But the involvement in Nazi crimes, like the supply of concentration camps and forced labor, same as possible resistance experiences, were overlapped with the focus on an accelerated economic reconstruction. For the restitution concept, voluntariness constitutes a main principle when assets are restituted by the perpetrators to the victims in order to admit that historical injustice took place. But the categorization of consumer cooperatives as victims was not separable from the stabilization of the Nazi system. The negotiations between the Hannover organization and its opponents reflect a wide range of how the destroyed experiences and social relationships were here handled. So now I come to the second case study concerning the German Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party. So this is another platform that we move on. For the purpose of opinion formation, the main part of their assets of the political parties was invested in press companies that have been expropriated by the Nazi in 1933. With this property, the Nazi could build up a huge propaganda apparatus just in time before their bankruptcy. The seizure took place in connection to the ban of the both parties as subversive. Emanating from the restitution proceedings of the Social Democrats and Communist press companies in Hanover, I could also make conclusions on their restitution throughout West Germany. The proceedings found their end only in 1968. The confrontations took here place on a discursive level that I described with the term of a political arena. The special status of the press companies belonging to the political parties resulted from the media work of political parties, which is based on the democratic principle of freedom of opinion and press. Thus, the activity of publishing houses as trustees of the political parties is located on the same level. The restitution instances required from the communists, but not from the Social Democratic Party, to uncover their finances and transactions before the Nazi seizure. Such an uncovering of the finances of a political party represents a political restriction of its freedom. The repeated requests related to the ban of the Communist Party in 1956. They reflect a cancellation of the state protection of the special organizations of the Communist Party. The concurrent respectings for the Social Democratic Party refers to the quality of the proceedings as venue of political revolts. The formation of political power in the proceeding represent how the state influence was concretely applied here, and that the past injustice was here reframed by politics of memory of the Cold War. The concealment of properties that is usual for political parties was here used as an instrument to exclude the Communist Party from restitution. This form of a discursive strategy became especially evident in the acknowledgement of press companies belonging to the Social Democratic Party. Already in 1946 in Hannover, the British military government attributed the former spaces of the Nazi publishing house to the post-war Social Democratic newspaper. At the same time, the Communist Party remained on the outside of these processes. The verbalizations in the proceedings show bitter fights between the both parties and how the Cold War constellations were carried out and coded socially and culturally on the German sublevel. So here you can see on the left the former trade union house in Hanover, where the Social Democratic newspaper Volkswille was printed. The trade unions and the Social Democratic Party were connected by a privileged partnership. But due to the common failing when faced with the rise of the National Socialism, this relation could not be revived after 1945. First, in 1983, grace to the initiative of the German trade union, in the former place of the trade union house, a memorial stone was placed. You can see this here in the middle. Today, this picture on the left is accessible on the webpage of the resistance organization Sozialistische Front. The image on the right, showing the communist printing company in Hanover, was first published in the frame of my work. In the restitution proceedings, Nazi resistance acts of the communist press companies were ignored, when it was overheard that estimated 3/4 of the communist assets were brought in security before the Nazi seizure. These acts found also no place in the memory culture. Even though the restitution rights of the Social Democratic Party were recognized in 1948, when the Restitution Commission AOA, Allgemeiner Organisationsausschuss, was established in Celle solely for their purposes. Their restitution rights were not applied in practice since the beginning by the German institutions. Rather, we can speak here about a hardening of these rights into a legal statement by their repetition over nearly 20 years. This became especially evident in 1968 in the so-called global settlement, Globalvergleich, with the Federal Ministry of Finances, when 19 million Deutschmark were attributed to the board of the Social Democratic Party as compensation for the deprivation of their publishing rights during the Nazi era. This restitution payment took place without the possibility of bringing evidence for the persecution and seizure. Which conditions were imposed on the Social Democratic Party remains unknown, also due to the fact that further historical sources remain under closure. However, the correspondence of the lawyers of the Social Democratic Party proves that until 1968, approximately 40 million Deutschmark were paid to the party. This stands in clear contrast to the so-called disqualification of the Communist Party from the restitution. Their proceedings were closed in 1968 when the trustee, the stock company Diligentia AG, was liquidated. Already in 1930, the shares of the German communist printing companies were transferred to Switzerland on this company. When analyzing the acknowledgement versus disqualification of the mentioned press companies, a 20-year-long dispute between the both parties on one printing press from the Rote Fahne in Berlin served me to show how the proceedings developed. What was sayable on the beginning and how were self-images constructed with the help of othering? For the deconstruction of discursive formations under the power relations during the German-German separation, the concept of othering from the post-colonial theory was here really helpful. Summing up, it was not about politics of remorse at all. The Diligentia was seen as an extended arm of the communists from East Germany, and thus the restitution rights of the communists in West Germany were practically frozen since 1951. Since the very beginning, no jurisdiction of the Restitution Commission was given. Rather, the discourse on restitution, in the discourse on restitution, the anti-communist fight materialized as a legitimate worldview that determined also the restitution of the Social Democratic Party. The undermining of the goals of the proceedings led in total to the impossibility to distinguish between morality and immorality on the supra-individual level. So I come to the conclusion quickly. So my deconstruction of the arguments between the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party shows how the historical injustice was captured by the uprising westernization and economic interests of the Federal Republic of Germany. The material acknowledgement for the persecution damages of the Social Democratic Party organizations and their press companies and the simultaneous denial for the communists happened in this context of resocialization and politics of memory. The according mass psychological transformation processes during the German separation were also reflected in the proceedings of the Hannover Co-op. Due to economic calculation, the business reconstruction and the asset relationships were approximately restored, but the practiced blindness to the past led to an expelling of the social economy perspective from the discourse. The discourses in the proceedings and the analysis of the linguistic representations reflect a form of restitution that was perceived as imposed, referring to the typical patterns of excuse of the early post-war time. This was especially evident in the lack of inner space to handle the given entanglements with the Nazi regime. Thank you for your attention.